On November 12, 1937, deputies found something in a hollow near Coal Creek, Kentucky, that would haunt county records for generations. The Ashcroft cabin sat perched on a ridge, its timbers darkened with age and neglect, overlooking a valley that had long ceased to welcome outsiders. According to county coroner records, the child's mother was never formally charged, and the case file was stamped restricted. The logbook entry, written in a careful, almost clinical hand, reads, "Child discovered beneath floorboards, no signs of struggle. Cause of death undetermined." The handwriting trembles slightly on the page, as if the scribe had felt the weight of what they had recorded. A surviving deputy who revisited the site decades later wrote in his 1973 field journal, "I've seen death before, but this? I can't explain it." He does not elaborate, but the ellipsis lingers like a breath between us and the horrors he glimpsed. What could drive a family into a state where such acts were conceivable? Was it mental illness, or generations of isolation twisting bloodlines and morals? Coal Creek had not been reached by paved roads in over a decade, and the hollows seemed to fold inward on themselves, as if the mountains themselves conspired to hide their secrets. In 1961, an interview with the McDowell Gazette quoted 83-year-old Lena Hartsfield, a lifelong resident of a neighboring ridge. "The Ashcrofts were different. Folks never went to their house unless they had to, and even then it felt like the walls were listening. You could hear the children sometimes howling at night, though the windows stayed closed." Her memory was fractured, and yet the specificity of the dates and names she recalled matched archival census records from the 1920s. The Ashcrofts, Josiah, Mary, and their 6 children, appear repeatedly in property tax ledgers, all listed as active, even when there were no burial records or school logs after 1925. The cabin itself was small and unassuming. Its roof sagged under decades of snow, its chimney crooked. When investigators first approached, the smell was not of death. It was of wet wool and milk gone sour. The way nursery rooms rot when no one sings anymore. Inside, investigators noted strange arrangements. Chairs facing the wall, plates stacked neatly in corners, and a hand-copied Bible open to verses no scholar had ever cited. The ink was smeared, the handwriting looping and uneven. In margins, one line repeated obsessively, "Speak not the names of those gone, or they will return to the hollow." County logs record other details that might seem incidental, but later proved chilling. Entry 402A, found girl in white dress, unresponsive. No shoes. No tracks. A child, alone but alive, wandering among the timber beams and debris. The case file suggests she was placed in foster care temporarily, but her records vanish after a single notation. Transferred unknown, age 10, Ashcroft lineage. She was not punished for what she did, she was punished for remembering what she had watched. Psychiatric evaluations from the 1940s, now partially declassified, note that she repeated phrases in guttural tones, seemingly independent of her own speech. Her eyes were described as knowing too much for one so young. The surrounding hollows bear witness in their own ways. Locals in 1936, interviewed for a government agricultural survey, reported an unnatural quiet that falls over the ridge when the wind dies. They spoke of children born in Coal Creek who did not cry, not once. And if they did, the old church bell would ring, though the bell tower had been abandoned for years. Property deeds show land changing hands silently, sometimes after fires that consumed all buildings except the Ashcroft cabin. The pattern repeated across decades: isolation, ritual, disappearance. By 1942, journalists attempting to document the holler were met with resistance. Letters between editors of regional newspapers show instructions to avoid Coal Creek entirely. Files were shredded, photographs destroyed. Yet fragments remain. A 1939 Kentucky Gazette clipping refers to a singular family whose children do not speak, only wail, and includes a photograph of a small, crooked cabin barely visible through the trees. Modern analysis confirms that the photo's timestamp matches the date of the coroner's report. The cabin has remained untouched, a silent witness to horrors no one dared catalog fully. Visitors who dared approach decades later described inexplicable phenomena. In 1987, teenagers reported seeing shadows move against the walls, always out of the corner of their eyes. In 1999, a photographer claimed his flash captured faces in the attic windows that vanished in the developing process. By 2006, hikers spoke of a figure standing silently on the ridge, screaming without sound, disappearing as soon as they approached. And to this day, no birds land near the chimney. No matter the season. No matter the wind. The Ashcrofts' rituals appear to have left traces in nearby counties as well. School rosters from the 1940s and 1950s show recurring surnames, Brumley, Callahan, McCrae, connected to similar reports of speech anomalies or children who wandered alone in the hills for hours. Census rolls show these families often intermarried, as if the Hollows were curating a lineage, preserving a pattern that authorities could neither understand nor stop. Handwritten notes from church basements describe hymns sung in guttural tones, alternating between pleas and screams, the meaning obscured by time but their impact unmistakable. Even now the legacy persists. A 2018 police log mentions a child drawing sigils resembling the Ashcroft mark on classroom walls. A Reddit thread in 2020 recounted hearing a hymn in the mountains at night, impossible to trace. A Facebook post in 2023 described the cabin's windows lit when no electricity existed. The holler is no longer isolated in a purely geographical sense. It reaches forward through memory, social media, and imagination, ensuring that what began in the 1930s continues to reverberate. As researchers, we trace the Ashcroft name through court records, asylum files, and tax ledgers. The handwriting in a 1935 coroner report appears nearly identical to a 1967 school ledger and a 1994 police report. The letters curl the same way, the dots of the I.S. smudge in the same uncertain rhythm. Names echo across decades, and speaking them aloud seems to stir something dormant, something that survives in the hollows themselves. It is a lineage of absence, of screams, of unspeakable repetition. If your family kept journals like this one, if your grandmother warned you about the name Ashcroft, or if your childhood drawings ever matched what you just heard, tell us. Leave it below. And subscribe, because if they erased one family, they may have erased yours too. Every comment, every note, every story brought forward helps illuminate the hollows that history tried to leave in shadow. The Ashcrofts were not meant to be remembered, but the hollers insist otherwise. The screams linger in the timber. The ink of county ledgers refuses to dry. And the wind through the ridge carries their voices still, asking to be heard, asking to be known. Coal Creek had never been fully mapped. The roads that might have carried commerce or curiosity into its hollows were left unfinished, eaten by mudslides and neglect. Satellite maps today still show the area as broken lines cutting through dense forest, a town frozen in absence. Property deeds from 1924 list parcels that were never developed, homes that were never built, and businesses that closed before opening. In 1925, the Coal Creek Mining Company shuttered its last shaft, sending families deeper into isolation. Census records show the town's population dropping from 432 in 1920 to 58 by 1940, a descent that mirrors the holler itself folding inward, swallowing those who remained. The geography of Coal Creek contributed to its silence. Hills rose steep and unbroken, rivers ran sluggish through silted banks, and fog rolled in from the north, thick enough to obscure vision for miles. Timberlands were dense, often hiding cabins that were decades old but left untended. Tax ledgers confirmed that several Ashcroft properties were active on paper, but satellite surveys reveal foundations now buried beneath soil and brush. Coal Creek existed in documentation and in whispers, but rarely in photographs that survived government archives. A 1933 agricultural survey recorded the holler as difficult to traverse, prone to flooding, and with minimal communication to surrounding counties. The surveyor notes a single community building that doubled as a schoolhouse and church, its windows shuttered against the cold winds, its bell rung only on the rare holidays. Local informants, later interviewed in 1962 for a McDowell Gazette feature, remembered the building as always empty, always echoing. Children would run the perimeter, their bare feet pressing against stones that had long since been marked with initials and crude carvings. The soil still bore traces of footsteps, some too small for children, too deliberate for the wild. Coal Creek's economic collapse made isolation worse. Families survived on small plots of farmland, raising goats and chickens, trading goods in hushed tones with those who dared approach. Ledgers from the McDowell County Cooperative show shipments of milk and corn collected once a year, often delayed or spoiled. Photographs of the time depict a landscape of weathered fences, leaning barns and abandoned miners' shacks, the hollows between ridges growing thicker with shadow. Officials visiting the town noted in reports that the people seemed reticent, almost silent, with eyes that avoided contact. The town was marked by absence as much as presence. School logs from 1930 show irregular attendance, with entire weeks unaccounted for. Medical records indicate sporadic vaccinations, incomplete birth certificates, and children recorded as unknown parentage, despite living in identifiable households. Newspapers sporadically referenced Coal Creek, often in conjunction with mining accidents or unexplained disappearances. One 1931 clipping reads, "Holler families continue to dwindle, county authorities unable to reach or account for all residents. The hollows themselves seem to hold secrets, and the land conspired to keep them hidden." An entry in the county courthouse archive from 1928 notes that a deputy was sent to verify the well-being of the McCrae family after months of silence. The report reads, "House locked from within. No response to repeated knocks. Smoke rising from chimney. Upon entry, children observed outside, staring silently. Adults absent. Records updated to no contact possible." Instances like this repeat in logs across decades, reflecting the town's tendency to vanish from oversight without leaving tangible evidence. Coal Creek's isolation shaped both the environment and its people. Handwritten diaries discovered in 1945 in the attic of a collapsed Ashcroft property describe winters spent in near darkness, months without visitors, and nights filled with howls that are not animals. Residents recorded in these diaries mention the wind carrying voices, the fog thickening like wool over the mountains, and the constant vigilance against outsiders. These same diaries note that children learned the holler before they could walk, suggesting a deep, almost ritualized relationship with the land itself. The remnants of infrastructure tell a quiet story. Bridges built hastily in 1919 are now collapsed into the creek. Rail lines constructed to transport coal stop abruptly at broken trestles. Telephone poles lean at impossible angles, their wires snapping in the wind. Letters in the McDowell Gazette archives reference repeated attempts to connect Coal Creek to surrounding towns. A 1927 dispatch reads, "Road construction halted, terrain deemed impassable, residents advised to maintain isolation." The town's geography became a literal barrier to intervention, a natural lock sealing the Ashcrofts and other families into the holler for decades. By 1937, Coal Creek had become a repository for the forgotten and the secret. County planning maps from 1936 show the town as a scatter of parcels with no clear streets. Tax assessments from the same period list families who never appeared in census records, and the Ashcrofts occupy multiple lots under slightly different names, suggesting legal obfuscation. Interviews with older residents, archived in 1965, describe the holler as breathing like a living thing, a place where the mountains themselves seemed aware of who belonged and who did not. Natural elements reinforced the town's dread. Fog rolled in nightly, waterlogged soil retained every footprint, and trees twisted to block sunlight in the hollows. Researchers who visited the area in the late 1970s noted that the air carried a faintly metallic smell, like old iron and rotting wood. Streams in the valley were sluggish, their surfaces reflecting shapes that disappeared when approached. Photographs taken in 1978 show long shadows, sometimes of figures that could not be identified, standing at odd angles on ridge lines. Coal Creek's isolation also created a culture of silence and observation. Church attendance records from 1935 show nearly full attendance, but interviews decades later reveal that congregants often worshipped in fear, their hymns echoing in empty pews. School logs describe children learning in rooms where light barely reached the boards, taught to memorize scripture but never permitted to question it. County inspection reports note that parents were overly protective, refusing entry to officials or teachers, leaving entire generations largely unmonitored. The holler continues to exist in fragmented memory. A 1994 McDowell Gazette article references Coal Creek families rarely seen, rarely accounted for, and photographs of the ridges remain grainy, almost spectral. Visitors speak of the wind carrying words in an unknown language and of hearing laughter that does not belong to anyone alive. Even after decades of logging, hiking, and satellite imaging, Coal Creek refuses to yield fully to observation. Its shadows hold the stories of its families, their routines, their disappearances, and their silences. And so Coal Creek waits. The land has absorbed the echoes of its residents, of families like the Ashcrofts, who moved through hollows that devoured their names. It waits in fog, in collapsed bridges, in the hollowed eyes of abandoned schoolhouses. The town exists both in documents and in memory, as a place that cannot be properly surveyed or fully described, a place that insists on remaining hidden. It is a holler where geography is as much a character as any resident, shaping the lives, the fears, and the legacies of those who dared to live there. The Ashcrofts appear in the county ledgers like a ghost family, their presence marked more by absence than by action. Josiah Ashcroft, recorded in the 1920 McDowell County Property Tax Register, owned multiple parcels along the eastern ridge, each assessed but largely undeveloped. His wife, Mary, is noted as managing household and livestock, though no employment records or census entries confirm her movements after 1925. Their children, 6 in total, appear intermittently in school logs, often with whole months missing, their ages approximated rather than documented. The family's trajectory is a series of gaps, a chain of entries that stop abruptly, leaving questions where details should be. Archival investigation shows that the Ashcrofts were not unique in their erasure, though their circumstances were extreme. Missing persons files from 1927 to 1938 reference children absent from school, residence uncertain, often linked to the same ridge lines that the Ashcrofts occupied. Court documents from neighboring counties describe transfers of minors with notes like parentage unclear, temporary foster until further notice, yet follow-up files never appear. The property deeds reveal small patterns of name variations, Ashcroft, 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 suggesting legal maneuvers intended to obscure lineage. Photographs discovered in 1940 in a McDowell Gazette archive depict the family posed outside the cabin. Josiah's coat buttoned too tightly, Mary's skirt frayed and patched, children staring directly into the camera with unblinking eyes. The photographer's notes indicate that the session lasted longer than expected, with repeated instructions for the children to smile. They did not. Later testimony filed in a 1961 interview with Lena Hartsfield recalls, they never smiled. They didn't cry either. Just watched. The children's gaze, caught in grainy silver nitrate, feels as if it reaches beyond the frame, a warning embedded in the texture of the photo itself. The hollers shaped their lives in ways that documents barely capture. Diaries uncovered in the 1950s in a collapsed outbuilding reveal that the Ashcroft children were taught the landscape before they could form words. Instructions were passed down orally, often as chants, directions to hidden paths, signals for approaching outsiders, warnings of which ridges to avoid. These instructions, when cross-referenced with topographical surveys, describe paths that no road or trail would acknowledge. The family moved like shadows, their presence detectable only by the remnants of footprints and the occasional faint smoke from the cabin chimney. Medical records from the 1930s add further complexity. Several of the Ashcroft children were examined by county doctors after being brought to the schoolhouse for minor injuries. Reports describe children who exhibited delayed speech development, unusual vocalizations, and highly ritualized behaviors. One entry dated March 12, 1934 notes, child repeats sounds resembling a howl, ceases when questioned directly. Eye contact maintained but unblinking. Family expresses no concern, describes behavior as customary. These observations, tucked into otherwise mundane records, suggest a family operating under a set of rules and rituals entirely separate from the outside world. The Ashcrofts' erasure intensified with time. School attendance rolls, incomplete and faded, end abruptly in 1928 for the younger children. Jail ledgers record a brief incarceration of Josiah in 1932 for public disturbance, but the family disappears from court records thereafter. In probate files, several parcels of land remain registered to the family, yet taxes are sporadically recorded, often with marginal notes like owner presumed absent or no contact. County correspondence indicates that repeated attempts to locate the Ashcrofts were met with resistance from locals who described the family as private, insular, not to be disturbed. Oral history, often dismissed by officials, paints a more vivid picture. A 1965 interview with resident Margaret Callahan recalls, "You knew where the Ashcrofts were by the sounds, not the lights. You'd hear the children at dusk, voices rising in a kind of chant or scream. No one went near unless they had to, and even then, it felt like the hills themselves were holding you back." Microfilm archives of the McDowell Gazette show that letters sent to editors, reporting the Ashcrofts' unusual activities, were returned marked, address unknown, or do not publish. The family's narrative, though partially recorded, was actively suppressed. In 1937, the discovery of the buried child beneath the Ashcroft cabin floorboards punctuated the hollers' pattern of secrecy and isolation. Coroner reports confirmed the child had been alive only moments before being concealed, though details are intentionally sparse. The cabin's interior, examined in 1938, revealed remnants of ritualistic arrangements. Chairs facing walls, small carved symbols and floorboards, and an inverted Bible open to cryptic passages. Handwriting analysis of notes found within the cabin matches that of property records, suggesting that the family maintained meticulous, private documentation that existed parallel to official county archives. The Ashcrofts' erasure is further underscored by anomalies in census data. A comparative review of 1920 to 1940 records shows multiple children listed as Ashcrofts in 1920, absent in 1930, and ambiguously recorded in 1940 under variations of the surname. County tax ledgers, however, continue to list Josiah Ashcroft as responsible for multiple plots, including the cabin and surrounding land, through 1942. These discrepancies imply a deliberate layering of documentation, records that exist to obscure rather than clarify the family's presence. Beyond records, the landscape itself remembers. Locals recount that the ridges surrounding the cabin are unnaturally silent. Wind carries no birdsong. Trees creak with a weight that seems to acknowledge human absence. Photographs from the 1970s show the Ashcroft cabin still standing, largely unchanged, while nearby structures collapse under neglect. An aerial survey in 1982 reveals paths trodden in patterns inconsistent with conventional movement, as if the family's influence persists in the land itself. The Ashcrofts were a lineage trapped in the holler, living according to rules unknown to outsiders. They moved in shadows, spoke in codes, and left records intentionally ambiguous. County correspondence, school logs, photographs, and oral histories converge to suggest a family operating under their own laws, one defined by isolation, ritual, and an understanding of the mountains that outsiders could never fully grasp. They were both present and absent, remembered only through fragments and whispers, leaving behind the enduring impression that what is hidden can shape the holler as profoundly as what is visible. The Ashcrofts' home was not the only place where their influence lingered. The small church at the edge of Coal Creek, long abandoned by the 1930s, served as a repository of their beliefs, a space where faith and ritual blurred into something incomprehensible to outsiders. Diaries recovered from beneath floorboards in 1952 described the church basement as cool and damp, with the smell of ink and old wood. We sing here because the mountains listen. Hand-copied Bibles, discovered in the same location decades later, contained verses inverted or rewritten in the margins, passages that spoke of obedience, silence, and unseen forces that demanded attention. County records show the church was officially deconsecrated in 1929, yet Ashcroft family members continue to use it as a gathering space. Parish registers, partially recovered in 1961, list events with no corresponding entries in civil records. Baptisms recorded without dates, marriages acknowledged without witnesses, confessions logged in code. One page, preserved under glass, lists 20 names, all variations of Ashcroft, each accompanied by cryptic notations that remain untranslated. Investigators in the 1970s described the handwriting as deliberate yet unnerving, letters stretching and curling like they were reaching for something unseen. Local accounts reveal a hierarchy of instruction and punishment within the family and its spiritual practice. Children were instructed in the hollow hymn, a chant that alternated between syllables resembling speech and guttural howls. A 1935 teacher's note, found in a McDowell Gazette microfilm archive, records that 2 children were observed repeating the hymn in the schoolyard, unprompted, with eyes fixed on the mountains. The observer noted that the rhythm and tone did not match any known song or prayer and seemed to hold the children in a trance. Other diary entries describe children punished not for transgression but for forgetting the hymn, sometimes left in the basement for hours, reciting under dim candlelight. Handwritten sermon notes recovered in 1941 suggest that adults reinforced these rituals through storytelling and parables unique to the holler. One passage reads, "The mountains watch, the trees remember, and the children's voices feed the hollow. Keep the song alive, for the song is law." The margins of the note carry drawings of small, faceless figures, each encircled by an odd pattern resembling the sigils found later in the cabin floorboards. These symbols appear across multiple Ashcroft artifacts, linking the family's domestic life, their rituals, and their engagement with the church as a space for secret practice. Medical records, when cross-referenced with school attendance logs, indicate that the ritualized lifestyle affected the children profoundly. Several children were evaluated for anxiety, delayed speech, and repetitive behaviors, often described in neutral, clinical terms. One report, dated August 22, 1936, states, "Child engages in prolonged vocalizations, unresponsive to questioning, repeats a series of sounds described as a hymn. Parent reports this is customary, part of nightly instruction." The formality of the language masks the strangeness of the behavior, yet it is preserved in official documentation, confirming that these rituals were ongoing, systemic, and observed by authorities who had no framework to interpret them. The Ashcrofts' rituals were codified, yet fluid. Diaries note that instructions passed orally could change nightly. A line of a hymn shifted, a step repeated in a different pattern, a symbol redrawn with slight variation. County coroner notes describe children brought to the school infirmary exhibiting sudden fear at certain words, gestures, or symbols. They do not cry, but their hands tremble, their heads turn as if listening to an invisible conductor. A 1937 coroner report observes, children's reactions suggest comprehension beyond reported cognitive development. No rational explanation provided. Family history noted for extreme isolation. Observers from outside the holler rarely witnessed these rituals directly, but fragments survive in letters, diaries, and the occasional police log. Entry 408B of a 1938 county notebook reads, strange singing heard from church basement at night. Children reported elsewhere in the valley. No adult present. Investigated, no evidence found. Observation continued. The note captures both the authorities' skepticism and the undeniable persistence of the practice. The holler itself seems to protect the rituals, concealing them beneath floorboards, behind shuttered windows, and within the thick fog that envelopes the valleys. In 1940, a researcher from the State Historical Society documented a series of Ashcroft-related artifacts recovered from the church basement. Ritual knives dulled from use, candle stubs still partially melted, and more hand-copied verses in fragile ink. Each artifact carries the same looping, deliberate handwriting seen in property deeds and cabin journals. The researchers' notes emphasize the repetition and intensity of the practices, noting that the children were consistently engaged in these rites, and adults appear to enforce a strict adherence to rhythm, chant, and gesture. The cultural logic of the holler reinforced the rituals. Neighbors' diaries describe a tacit agreement to avoid Coal Creek, to respect the boundaries imposed by the Ashcrofts and the geography alike. One 1954 journal entry reads, the Ashcrofts are not cruel, only persistent. You watch from the road and listen. You do not enter. That is the law of the ridge. These boundaries allowed the family to continue their practices largely undisturbed, ensuring that the holler itself became a stage upon which isolation and ritual could intertwine. Even as decades passed, the church basement remained a locus of memory. Photographs from 1976, taken by an amateur historian, show the cellar stairs partially intact, the walls blackened with age, the air heavy and still. Observers at the time described a sensation of quiet that presses against the chest, an absence of sound that was nonetheless alive with expectancy. Local folklore preserves the memory in subtle ways. The hollow hymn is said to linger in the wind, carrying through the trees, repeating in a rhythm only children can hear. The Ashcrofts' religious observances, their rituals, and their codified instructions created a world within Coal Creek that existed independently of law, school, or county oversight. Diaries, tax ledgers, and coroner files intersect with oral histories to reveal a pattern of teaching, observation, and repetition, all bound by geography and secrecy. The church basement, though physically empty for decades, holds the imprint of this structure, an echo of songs, symbols, and human persistence. The holler absorbs these rituals, preserving their logic and their fear. Candles, ink, and murmured hymns leave marks on the air as much as on paper. Children learn the rhythm of the valley before they can walk, echoing the instructions of parents, grandparents, and the mountains themselves. And still, the church basement waits, a space defined by absence and presence, by law and ritual, by secrecy and surveillance. The outside world rarely acknowledged Coal Creek, but in the spring of 1935, something compelled attention. A teacher at the one-room school, overwhelmed by what she witnessed, sent a letter to the county superintendent describing children who did not speak English, children who communicated in wails and guttural chants. The letter survives in microfilm archives of the McDowell Gazette, marked in the margin, immediate attention requested, unusual speech patterns, potential neglect, unknown lineage. County records show the matter was reviewed briefly before being filed under other concerns and effectively buried. The document details observations that defy simple explanation. The teacher wrote of a child drawing symbols in chalk that resembled those found in Ashcroft diaries, the same looping, curling lines that appear on floorboards, margins, and walls across decades. One entry reads, the children do not cry, they do not laugh. When questioned, they respond with sounds that resemble both speech and scream. Their eyes follow the wind. School logs corroborate the teacher's observations. Attendance was inconsistent, names appearing and disappearing, ages uncertain. Children who attended 1 week would be absent the next, their presence recorded only in notes referencing temporary removal to home instruction, though no one outside the holler was allowed inside the Ashcroft residence. Local newspapers, when they did mention Coal Creek, framed it in terms of folklore and curiosity. A 1935 clipping preserved in the Gazette archives reads, "Residents report strange sounds echoing from ridges. Children said to utter cries not of this world." There is no byline, only the indication that the editorial staff decided the story was best left in rumor. Photographs accompanying the report show the ridge in fog, the cabin barely visible, a twisted chimney jutting upward like a skeletal finger. Archivists note that the image was retouched before publication, obscuring figures that may have appeared in the doorway. Court records provide further context. A coroner's inquest, held quietly in April of 1935, documents the examination of 2 Ashcroft children brought from the school. The inquest is terse, almost bureaucratic, noting that neither child responded to questioning, that both displayed unusual vocalizations and behaviors inconsistent with documented development. An assistant coroner's note reads, "Further observation recommended. Family cooperative but nonverbal regarding child care. No charges were filed, no follow-up mandated, and the case files were stamped restricted, a designation repeated in dozens of subsequent Ashcroft-related documents." The event did not end there. A local midwife, interviewed in 1963 for a Gazette retrospective, recalled delivering a child in 1935 whose first sounds were not cries but a prolonged, unbroken scream. County birth records note the infant as healthy, yet the family recorded the child in private ledgers with annotations describing the scream as a sign of blessing, not distress. Later notes indicate the child's development was guided according to ritual instruction, including daily recitations of the Hollow Hymn. Researchers in the 1970s, reviewing surviving diaries and midwife logs, remarked that the family treated vocalizations as a form of language, a code only the holler could interpret. Police logs of the time confirm unusual activity. Entry 512C from March 1935 states, "Complaint received regarding noises from Ashcroft cabin. Officers dispatched. Observation inconclusive. No public disturbance noted. Follow-up deferred." The language is clinical, yet the subtext is undeniable. Authorities were aware of strange behavior yet unable or unwilling to intervene. Correspondence between sheriffs and the county clerk suggests repeated advisories to leave the family unexamined, emphasizing the family's isolation and potential mental instability rather than investigating ritual or abuse. Newspaper archives offer glimpses of the broader reaction. Letters to editors, preserved on microfilm, express fear and curiosity in equal measure. One correspondent writes, "I passed the ridge at dusk, children's voices carried to the road. They are not like any children I have known. There is a sound of old things in their cries." These letters, never published, sit in the Gazette archive, marked private correspondence, a deliberate effort to keep the event from public scrutiny. Researchers who uncovered the letters decades later note the meticulous handwriting, matching other Ashcroft documents, as if the family themselves recorded witness impressions. The event reached a symbolic apex when the first child's burial under the cabin floorboards was discovered in 1937. County coroner files describe the scene in stark detail, though sanitized for official record. Small coffin-like enclosure beneath timber, no signs of struggle, indicators of prolonged concealment. Property records from the period show Josiah Ashcroft retained ownership without interruption, his taxes sporadically paid, and his children absent from school and social records. These documents, when viewed together, suggest a pattern of ritualized isolation, enforced secrecy, and deliberate concealment. Witness statements, preserved in later interviews, add texture. In 1965, Margaret Callahan, a neighboring resident, described seeing the children in the valley before the event. "They moved together, all 6, like shadows across the ridge. Sometimes they would pause and make a sound that pierced the air. I thought it was the wind at first, but it wasn't. You could hear it, feel it, like the mountains themselves were humming with them." Such testimony, when cross-referenced with diaries and coroner files, creates a picture of a family operating on a rhythm defined by the holler, where children's cries were instruments and the land itself was complicit in the secrecy. The community's response was muted. Letters, tax ledgers, and school reports indicate neighbors observed the Ashcrofts from a distance, noting their peculiarity, but avoided intervention. Oral histories from residents interviewed in the 1960s describe a tacit agreement. The family would not be approached, the cabin would remain undisturbed, and the children's chants would not be interrupted. In this silence, the holler itself became the arbiter of law, morality, and ritual, preserving the event in memory, song, and document alike. The outside world noticed, but only in fragments. Newspaper clippings, coroner files, school logs, and letters document moments of intervention, observation, and speculation. Yet the full scope of the event, its causes, rituals, and long-term impact, remains obscured. Every fragment of record points to a family that existed in parallel to law and society, a family whose actions were observed but never fully comprehended. The Ashcrofts' rituals, the children's chants, the buried child, and the mountains themselves converge into a record of isolation, secrecy, and persistence that defies complete understanding. The hollow retains the memory. Fog rolls across the ridge in the same pattern noted by the 1935 teacher. Shadows cling to collapsed fences and abandoned paths. The hollow hymn, once heard only inside the cabin or basement, drifts through the air when the wind is right, carrying with it the echoes of the event that first drew attention from the outside world. Coal Creek may appear empty to a casual observer, but every stone, every tree, every ridge remembers. Every document, every photograph, every marginal note preserves the resonance of the Ashcrofts' world. The witnesses to Coal Creek's horrors were few, and their testimonies fragmentary. County archives hold only a handful of interviews, scattered across decades, often filed under restricted or miscellaneous, yet together they form an eerie pattern. One of the earliest surviving statements comes from a teacher, Eleanor Fields, who in 1935 recounted what she observed in her schoolhouse. They do not speak like other children. Their eyes follow shadows. They chant without pause, and sometimes the air trembles when they do. The original document, yellowed with age, carries marginal notes in a separate hand, likely from a deputy or social worker. Observation verified. Children returned to residence. Family insistent on ritual compliance. Another witness, captured in a 1942 asylum intake form, describes the youngest Ashcroft child brought in for evaluation. The form notes that the child repeated nonsensical sounds continuously, hands tracing patterns on the floor, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Attempts to engage verbally met with a visceral recoil. The attending psychiatrist, Dr. Samuel Hartsfield, added in his notes, "I have seen psychosis, trauma, neglect. This is neither." The child's behavior suggests immersion in a coded system, a language that transcends ordinary understanding. Hartsfield's handwriting curls tightly as if compressed by both urgency and unease, and the notes end with a single underlined word, observe. Oral histories provide further texture. In a 1963 interview, Lena Hartsfield, who lived on a ridge overlooking the Ashcroft cabin, described seeing the children from a distance. They moved like smoke in the trees. Sometimes they'd stop mid-step and scream, but it wasn't pain. It was a sound that filled the holler. You could feel it in your chest. No one dared speak to them. Lena's words, preserved in a county microfilm archive, convey both fear and awe. Her recollection aligns with school records, property deeds, and diaries found in the cabin's attic, revealing a consistency that cannot be dismissed as folklore alone. Witnesses often disappeared or withdrew from the record shortly after making their statements. A 1937 police log notes that a neighbor who reported unusual activity on the ridge ceased all correspondence. Moved west. No forwarding address. In 1941, a visiting photographer documented faint, blurred shapes in the cabin windows. The report concludes, subjects unseen. Observers unaccounted for. Investigation deferred. Diaries and letters later found among relatives corroborate this pattern. Those who witnessed or approached the Ashcrofts often retreated into silence, leaving only fragmented records of what they had observed. A particularly haunting testimony comes from Margaret Callahan, a child at the time, later interviewed in 1965. "I watched from the creek. The children sang. Their mother. She stood behind them, her hands moving in the air like she was conducting some invisible orchestra. I tried to leave, but the hills seemed to bend my path back toward the cabin. I ran, but I felt them watching even after I was gone." Margaret's statement aligns with patterns noted in school reports and coroner files. The Ashcroft children were not merely present. They were central to a ritual system that permeated both land and witness. Coroner records emphasize the same unease. Entry 419D, dated 1938, describes a child discovered wandering near the ridge in early morning, unresponsive to questioning. Clothing intact. No tracks leading away from property. Return to guardianship. Witness reports indicate fear of family reprisal. Observation recommended. Marginal notes stress repeated observations over weeks, suggesting a systematic effort to monitor, yet never fully understand, the family's internal dynamics. The Ashcrofts' control over perception, over who saw, who spoke, who remembered, was pervasive. A series of letters from local officials to state authorities, dated 1939 to 1941, hints at bureaucratic frustration. Repeated inquiries into family activities yield no cooperation, one reads. Another notes, witnesses often recant or disappear. Patterns suggest deliberate isolation enforced by family or geography. These letters, often ignored or misfiled, underscore the holler's power. Witnesses' voices existed only as fragments, scattered across archives, unreliable in themselves but together forming a coherent pattern of observation, fear, and suppression. Even decades later, witnesses' experiences continued to resonate. In 1978, a hiker who trespassed on the ridge reported seeing the Ashcroft cabin illuminated at twilight, though the land had no electricity. He described hearing children chanting softly, stepping in rhythm with shadows, yet no one emerged when he called. Police logs confirm a report of trespass at the same location but note, no subjects located. Sounds verified by witnesses, origin inconclusive. Witnesses' descriptions, repeated across time, maintain an eerie consistency, as if the holler preserves its own truth independent of human memory. The family's rituals, combined with the geography and the isolation, transformed observers into participants in a silent covenant. Those who saw too much either left or were rendered silent by fear. Diaries of neighbors note subtle changes in behavior after witnessing the children. Sleep disturbances, dreams filled with faint chants, recurring visions of the cabin. One 1943 journal entry states, "I can hear them in my dreams. The children, the song, the hollow calling me back." Witnesses carried the holler with them, long after leaving, their perception shaped by both proximity and distance. Archival interviews from 1960 to 1970 show a lingering obsession with the Ashcrofts among older residents. In one recorded session, a woman describes the house as alive with whispers. Another recounts hearing the hollow hymn in the woods at dawn, the children's voices seeming to rise from both earth and air simultaneously. These testimonies, corroborated by microfilm records and property surveys, show that the Ashcrofts' influence persisted well beyond their physical presence. Witnesses were transformed into chroniclers of the unseen, their words forming the skeletal structure of a history that official documents could never fully contain. Even official observers could not remain neutral. Reports from the county sheriff's office emphasize a repeated inability to intervene. Subjects resist all contact. Witness accounts suggest non-standard behaviors, potentially ritualistic. Observation maintained but intervention deferred due to geographical constraints and familial influence. Across decades, the pattern is clear. Those who saw the Ashcrofts and survived the experience, left traces but only in scattered documents, marginal notes, and personal testimony. The holler itself filtered observation, leaving behind fragments that continue to inform researchers today. The witnesses, therefore, exist as both record and warning. Their words, partially preserved, guide anyone who approaches Coal Creek. The hills, ridges, and cabins carry echoes of their observations, as if geography itself remembers. Every microfilm entry, coroner report, and oral history contributes to an archive larger than any single file. And in the holler, memory is persistent. The children's songs, the adults' rituals, the witnesses' fear, all converge into a network of evidence that cannot be erased, no matter how restricted the files may be. Coal Creek's story did not exist solely in isolation. It was actively obscured. County records, letters, and newspaper archives reveal a pattern of deliberate suppression, beginning with the first reports of unusual activity in the 1920s and continuing through the mid-20th century. Sheriff's logs, partially recovered in 1938, note repeated attempts to investigate the Ashcroft family, yet each entry concludes with a variation of the same observation. Residents uncooperative. Observation noted. Further action deferred. Marginal annotations suggest internal frustration. Deputies questioned why the family's behavior was tolerated, yet the orders from above emphasized restraint. Correspondence between county officials and the state prosecutor's office further illuminates the mechanisms of silence. A letter from 1936 states, "Repeated inquiries into Ashcroft property and behavior yield no actionable evidence. Family asserts privacy rights. No public intervention recommended. Consideration for restricted filing." Another memorandum, dated 1941, notes that investigative journalists were warned against reporting on the holler, citing the potential to incite unnecessary public alarm. These letters, preserved in a restricted archive, suggest that both law enforcement and media were complicit in maintaining Coal Creek's secrecy, actively curating which truths would survive in public memory. Fire also played a role in erasure. Court records describe an incident in 1939 when a warehouse storing property deeds, coroner files, and school logs related to Coal Creek burned under unknown circumstances. Investigators noted that the blaze was confined to specific sections of the building, sparing unrelated documents while destroying key Ashcroft records. Insurance claims and subsequent reports suggest no natural cause, though nothing was ever proven. Archivists reviewing surviving fragments of the files decades later observed that the destruction coincided with a spike in absentee reports from the holler and a cessation of outsider observation. The church basement, a repository of ritual and belief, was similarly hidden. Parish records were never fully surrendered to county authorities. A 1942 survey notes, church ledger incomplete. Handwritten notations indicate private observances. Attempts to copy ledger obstructed by structural barriers and family resistance. Oral histories corroborate that the basement was considered off-limits, both socially and spiritually. Residents describe an unspoken understanding. No one questioned the Ashcrofts, no one intervened, and any attempt to breach their space was met with intimidation or supernatural suspicion. County school records reveal further suppression. Reports of irregular attendance, unusual behavior, and coded language among the Ashcroft children were filed but repeatedly classified as internal review only. Teachers' letters to the superintendent describe chanting, strange symbols, and children who appear suspended between fear and ritual, yet these concerns never prompted formal investigation. Microfilm archives show redacted sections, entries obscured with ink blotches or marginal notes reading, "Do not distribute." By systematically filtering information, authorities ensured that Coal Creek's anomalies were minimized, contained, and largely erased from public discourse. Local newspapers also played a role. The McDowell Gazette and surrounding county publications contain letters, editorials, and reports referencing Coal Creek, yet most were never published. One 1937 letter, penned by a resident observing children chanting in the valleys, is marked in the margin, "Do not print. Legal counsel advises against publication." Another editorial note suggests that the story was too localized, potentially inflammatory, and unverifiable. The effect was to erase Coal Creek from the broader cultural memory, preserving it as rumor, fragment, and whispered warning rather than documented fact. Even law enforcement internal communications reveal subtle intimidation. A 1940 deputy log mentions a warning given to a neighbor for attempting to document the Ashcrofts' rituals. The note reads, "Citizen advised that interference may provoke family retaliation. Observation suspended." Similar entries describe residents coerced into silence, filing reports only to be redirected or dismissed. The holler itself enforced these dynamics. Geography, family influence, and local compliance combined to shield Coal Creek from external scrutiny. The suppression extended to property records and legal oversight. Variations in the Ashcroft surname, duplicated land parcels, and discrepancies in tax filings suggest deliberate obfuscation. County clerks noted anomalous entries, yet these were rarely challenged. Deeds, coroner files, and school logs that survived are fragmentary, scattered across multiple locations and heavily redacted. Scholars examining these records decades later observed patterns of concealment consistent with intentional suppression rather than mere clerical error. The result was a landscape of partial truths. Outsiders who tried to piece together the Ashcrofts' existence encountered obstacles at every turn. Photographs were retouched, letters remained unpublished, and official files were stamped restricted. The holler, already geographically isolated, became administratively invisible. Those who knew more, teachers, neighbors, midwives, deputies, either left the area or recanted their accounts under pressure. Every attempt to document Coal Creek encountered resistance, whether through bureaucratic channels, social expectation, or fear of reprisal. Oral histories reinforce the impact of suppression. Residents interviewed in the 1960s recall a community conditioned to silence. One elder notes, "You didn't speak about the Ashcrofts. Not at the store, not at church, not on the road." The holler punished those who remembered too loudly. The pattern is clear. Suppression was both formal and informal, a mixture of legal authority, local consensus, and cultural compliance that ensured Coal Creek remained largely inaccessible, even as observers occasionally glimpsed fragments of its truth. This web of suppression explains why the Ashcroft story emerges only in fragments. Diaries, marginalia, school logs, and witness interviews provide glimpses, yet a coherent record never fully materializes. County archives contain gaps so conspicuous they suggest active removal. Photographs show blurred shapes that may be children or shadows. Letters describe sounds in the valley that authorities never documented officially. The holler itself, in combination with bureaucratic indifference or intentional concealment, enforces a layered secrecy that persists across decades. Coal Creek was silenced, but not entirely. Its traces survive in whispers, in diaries, and in documents that were never meant to be discovered. The suppression created a vacuum, a liminal space in which the Ashcrofts' rituals, the children's voices, and the holler's memory could persist unmonitored. Every fragment that endures is therefore precious. A photograph, a school log, a coroner's note, or an oral recollection becomes a rare window into a world that authorities, neighbors, and time itself tried to erase. The Ashcroft cabin remains perched on the ridge, its silhouette etched against the sky, defiant and indifferent to time. Property deeds from 1942 list the home under Josiah Ashcroft's name, though census records note the family largely absent. Observers in the 1960s described it as hollow yet alive, a structure imbued with presence despite neglect. Photographs from the era show weathered planks, a sagging roof, and the chimney, still upright, reaching like a skeletal finger toward the clouds. The air surrounding the house carries the residue of ritual, of repetition, of lives lived in code and isolation. Visitors report the same unsettling sensations across decades. In 1987, a historian attempting to document the ridge recounted the smell: wet wool, sour milk, and smoke that lingered long after the chimneys had gone cold. A 1999 survey team noted the same. The floors creaked in patterns inconsistent with ordinary movement, as if the house itself was aware of observers, shifting subtly underfoot. Margins of notebooks kept by these visitors contain obsessive sketches, symbols etched in the floor, patterns carved into wood, circles repeated in unlikely formations. Each observer confirmed an intangible pressure, an expectation that the house demanded attention, obedience, or recognition. The interior preserves the remnants of the Ashcroft way of life. Floorboards bear faint, looping carvings, similar to those in the church basement and diaries. Hand-copied Bibles lie tucked beneath floor planks, open to inverted passages that speak of obedience, silence, and unseen oversight. Photographs recovered from the 1970s show remnants of ritual objects: candles melted into the floor, small clay figurines, and marks that suggest repeated, deliberate actions. Observers noted that the items are not arranged haphazardly, but in strict sequences, indicating a system, a hierarchy, and a logic that outsiders can barely comprehend. Eyewitness reports emphasize the children's echoes. A man visiting in 2006 recalls seeing faint shadows moving through the windows as the sun dipped behind the ridge. No children were present, yet the creaks of floorboards, the faint rustle of curtains, and the subtle vibrations in the walls suggested activity. Property surveys note that no animals were present to account for the movement, no wind to disturb the boards. Observers reported a sensation of being watched, as though the house itself retained a consciousness, shaped by the presence and rituals of those who lived and vanished within it. The Ashcroft cabin exerts an influence beyond its walls. Local folklore describes an invisible boundary. Travelers passing the ridge report sudden disorientation, compasses spinning, and paths returning to the cabin no matter the intended direction. Diaries from the 1960s and 1970s note repeated instances of trespassers leaving in haste, feeling compelled to return only to find the house silent and undisturbed. In several accounts, witnesses mention hearing the hollow hymn faintly through the walls, carried on the wind, though no children are present. Photographs and sketches from past visitors reveal patterns consistent with the Ashcroft rituals. Circles drawn on the floorboards, small markings along thresholds, and repeating symbols on window frames suggest continuity between the cabin and the church basement. Observers attempting to trace these patterns report a disorienting effect, a perception that the symbols themselves exert influence, guiding attention, shaping memory, and enforcing the family's secret logic. The cabin, though uninhabited, functions as both record and participant in a living system of ritual and control. Coroner files and property records intersect with these observations. Notes from 1937 describe the buried child beneath the cabin floorboards, the methodical concealment, and the ritualistic nature of the placement. Later inspections in the 1960s and 1980s found floorboards replaced but markings faintly visible beneath layers of wood, as though the house retained memory in its structure. Tax records show continuous ownership, yet the family was absent. Occupancy is recorded as vacant, though witness accounts contradict official documentation. The house, like the holler itself, straddles the boundary between record and lived reality, between absence and presence. Visitors consistently describe the same sensory impressions: Cold drafts in closed rooms, creaking floorboards with no visible source, shadows that bend unnaturally, and a pervasive sense of being observed. One surveyor in 1999 wrote, "The house is wrong. Not haunted, not alive in the conventional sense. But something persists here, a logic, a will, a memory embedded in the timber." These impressions align with historical documentation, oral histories, and diaries, creating a convergence between archival evidence and subjective experience. The house has become a repository for all that Coal Creek sought to conceal. Fire, bureaucracy, and official suppression could not erase it. Photographs, sketches, coroner reports, and property records all point back to this single structure, a standing testament to isolation, ritual, and the persistence of the Ashcroft family's influence. Its walls contain both the echoes of children and the shadow of adults, the rhythm of ritual and the silence of the suppressed witnesses. Even now, the ridge exerts an effect on those who approach. Hikers, historians, and trespassers report subtle disorientation, sudden fog, and the faintest whisper of the hollow hymn. Compasses spin, dogs refuse to enter, and the air feels heavier as if infused with memory. The house is more than architecture. It is a vessel for time, ritual, and secrecy, resisting observation and erasure. It exists as it always has, still standing, still wrong, a monument to the Holler's logic and the Ashcroft's unbroken presence. Coal Creek was not an anomaly. Archival research, property records, and oral histories reveal a pattern repeating across neighboring hollers and counties. Families with names like Holloway, Brackenridge, and Latham exhibit striking parallels to the Ashcrofts. Children who did not cry, adults who enforced secrecy, and rituals that seemed codified yet indecipherable to outsiders. School rosters from McDowell and Harlan counties, partially preserved in microfilm archives from the 1930s, list repeated surnames with odd annotations, observed chanting, repeated symbols, nonverbal responses, echoing the Ashcroft children's behavior. The Holloway family, for instance, appears in property deeds and school logs from 1927 to 1945, with children frequently absent for unspecified periods. A 1932 teacher's note reads, "Child speaks rarely. Appears to communicate through symbols scratched in books. Other children follow silently." Tax records corroborate residence, while coroner files note a child found wandering alone near the ridge, with no explanation for prolonged absence. Observers commented on a faint, repetitive chant that accompanied the child, later identified in diaries as resembling the hollow hymn documented among the Ashcrofts. Across county lines, similar patterns emerge. The Brackenridges of Little Coal Creek were described in a 1936 sheriff's report as isolated, secretive children displaying non-standard vocalization. School inspectors noted symbols etched into desks and walls that matched the Ashcroft Codex. Letters between local officials reference repeated warnings not to approach, emphasizing that the family's practices were private, insular, and potentially disruptive. Coroner files note instances where outsiders observed ritual-like gatherings in barns or basements, but no arrests or interventions were ever made. The repetition of names and behaviors suggests more than coincidence. Diaries recovered from multiple families contain near-identical marginal symbols, loops, curls, and sigils resembling those found in Ashcroft artifacts. These symbols appear in personal journals, property ledgers, and even prayer books. Researchers examining the pattern in the 1970s described it as a network of ritualized behavior embedded across the hollers, tied together by surname, geography, and shared practices. Observation notes emphasize not just repetition, but adherence to strict rules. Chant rhythm, placement of symbols, and silence during rituals. Oral histories reinforce these connections. A 1961 interview with a Little Coal Creek resident recalls seeing children from 3 different families gather at dusk, moving in synchronized steps while emitting guttural, unidentifiable sounds. "They didn't look at us, didn't notice us," the witness said. "It was like the mountains themselves were arranging them." A similar account comes from a 1955 interview with a resident near Harlan. Children would draw the same loops, the same circles. And the adults watched, guiding their hands, their voices, their eyes. "I never saw it in one family alone. It was everywhere." Medical and school records support these anecdotes. Children across the region were often recorded as nonverbal or communicating exclusively through gestures and symbols. Some were sent for psychiatric evaluation, only to be returned without treatment, noted as compliant with family customs. Entry 431D in a 1938 county log reads, "Child exhibits repeated symbolic behavior. Home structure rigidly enforced. No signs of abuse beyond environmental conditioning. Observers struggled to differentiate between neglect, discipline, and ritual. The hollers themselves, with ridges and fog, reinforced isolation, allowing patterns to continue unobserved by authorities. Property records reveal geographic clustering. Families practicing similar rituals occupy ridges, hollows, and valleys that are difficult to access. Tax ledgers, school registers, and voter rolls indicate continuity of residence, while anecdotal reports suggest deliberate avoidance of outsiders. Diaries from the era describe the hills themselves as participants. You can see them through the mist, children moving in unison, the earth bending around them. No one approaches. The ridges protect them. The geography, combined with repeated behaviors and surname continuity, forms a lattice through which ritual persists, hidden in plain sight. In 1942, an investigator from the State Historical Society documented multiple families' artifacts, hand-copied verses, etched symbols, and ritual implements. Observations note near-identical handwriting across separate households, suggesting either a shared instruction system or prolonged interconnection between families. Objects collected from different ridges, candles, chalk marks, figurines, exhibit the same sequences, as if a larger, unseen logic governed behavior across the hollers. Researchers describe the artifacts as evidence of a regional phenomenon, a web of practices resistant to authority, observation, and time. Even as decades passed, echoes of these patterns persisted. In 1978, a hiker reported seeing children from neighboring ridges moving in synchrony, chanting faintly through fog. Observers described shadows aligning, floorboards creaking in rhythm with distant calls, and the faint repetition of symbols on rocks, tree trunks, and walls. County records from the same period note missing persons reports, unexplained absences, and redacted school logs, echoing patterns first observed in the Ashcroft files. The evidence points to a systemic, regional phenomenon, a network of families practicing rituals that blend isolation, repetition, and symbolic language. The Ashcrofts were not alone. They existed within a landscape of reinforced secrecy, codified behavior, and geography that preserved the hollers' hidden logic. Each fragment, diary, ledger, coroner report, oral history, fits into a larger pattern, revealing that Coal Creek was not an isolated anomaly but part of a network that spanned ridges, valleys, and generations. The hollers do not forget, and Coal Creek is stirring once more. County police logs from 2017 onward note unusual reports. Children drawing symbols that mirror Ashcroft patterns in school classrooms, adults describing faint chants carried on the wind, and strange gatherings in valleys previously thought abandoned. Social media posts, often deleted quickly, show cryptic images of ridges shrouded in fog, with loops, curls, and sigils etched into the earth. Observers describe a familiarity, as though history repeats itself, layered over the same geography that once shielded the Ashcrofts. A police report from 2018 details a local teacher finding a child in a first-grade classroom repeatedly drawing sigils resembling those from historical Ashcroft diaries. The report notes, child exhibits unusual focus, repeating symbols for hours. Other children avoid interaction. No explanation for prior knowledge of symbols. Parent unaware of significance. School logs show that this was not an isolated case. Similar incidents appeared in neighboring counties. Interviews with parents reveal unease. The symbols appear independently, without instruction, echoing the regional patterns recorded in the 1930s and 1940s. Local historians corroborate that this is a recurrence, not coincidence. A 2019 survey conducted by a county archival team observed several homes where markings on walls and furniture matched historical Ashcroft patterns. In one house, chalk lines traced loops around door frames, identical to those found in surviving Ashcroft floorboards. Property records indicate these homes belong to families who can trace lineage back to Coal Creek and adjacent hollers, suggesting continuity of ritual knowledge across generations. Online forums, blogs, and community message boards document what some residents call the echo. A post from 2021 describes hearing a faint hymn in the woods, identical to the hollow hymn recorded in Ashcroft diaries. A nearby user responds, "I hear it too. Comes in the fog. Children are quiet. Adults won't speak of it. It's like the ridges themselves remember." These digital traces, though fleeting and often erased, mirror patterns noted in archival research, suggesting that the hollers' memory persists, interfacing with both human consciousness and geography. Local law enforcement has noticed anomalies as well. Logs from 2019 and 2020 record reports of individuals drawn to the ridge at dusk, disoriented, unable to leave along intended paths, compelled to return to the Ashcroft cabin or nearby hollows. Officers' notes describe a recurring theme. Trespassers often report hearing children chanting, seeing shadows moving in synchrony, and feeling the air thicken as if the land itself resists observation. Follow-up investigations often find no tangible evidence, yet the reports are consistent, echoing decades of prior documentation. Medical and school records from the past 5 years indicate behavioral parallels to historic patterns. Children exhibiting the symbols and chanting demonstrate heightened focus, extreme reticence, and resistance to standard social interaction. Observers note that these behaviors align precisely with rituals preserved in Ashcroft diaries, Holloway and Brackenridge logs, and oral histories. Psychologists consulted by local schools describe this as an unexplained cultural inheritance, though the historical and ritualized dimensions suggest something more persistent and systemic than conventional psychological phenomena. Even modern technology cannot fully shield observers from the holler's influence. Drones deployed to photograph the ridge report electronic interference, static interference, and inexplicable shadowing. Cell phone signals fluctuate in specific patterns around the cabin, and surrounding hollow satellite images reveal faint, recurring loops in vegetation, nearly identical to symbols documented in historical diaries and photographs. Researchers examining these images describe a landscape coded, a terrain repeating centuries-old patterns, indifferent to observation yet sensitive to acknowledgement. Local residents continue to corroborate this resurgence. Interviews from 2020 to 2023 reveal children reporting dreams of the ridge, adults hearing faint chants from empty hollows, and family pets refusing to enter certain areas. One 2022 interview notes, "The ridges hum. My daughter draws symbols I've never taught her. I see shadows in the fog that match the old photographs." These experiences mirror historic reports, suggesting that the holler itself preserves a logic, transmitting patterns across generations and resisting erasure. The recurrence is not confined to Coal Creek. Nearby hollers exhibit similar phenomena. Symbols appearing in homes, children chanting, shadows moving in synchronized patterns. County records, microfilm logs, and oral histories indicate a broader regional network, echoing the patterns noted among Ashcroft, Holloway, and Brackenridge families. Geography, lineage, and ritual converge, producing repetitions that span decades, leaving observers aware of their place in a continuum they can neither alter nor fully comprehend. The holler's memory persists because witnesses and observers continue to record, even if incompletely. Social media posts, school reports, property logs, and oral testimonies act as modern archival threads, connecting past to present. Each drawing, each chant, each observation strengthens the holler's continuity, preserving rituals that authorities attempted to suppress and families attempted to hide. Coal Creek is no longer a relic. It is a living archive, renewing itself through repetition, observation, and generational memory. Names carry weight in Coal Creek. The Ashcroft surname appears across decades in coroner files, property deeds, school logs, and diary entries, but rarely consistently. Variations, omissions, and redactions suggest that the very act of naming could shift record-keeping, erase evidence, or alter perception. Handwriting in surviving files appears identical across multiple decades. Loops, slants, and idiosyncrasies replicate the same signature style in documents separated by years, suggesting either a meticulous familial habit or something more unsettling, a continuity of presence encoded in ink and paper. Court records reveal the phenomenon further. In 1937, a deposition notes the family as Ashcroft Josiah, while a 1961 coroner report lists J. Ashcroft with near-identical handwriting. A 1984 property survey lists the ridge as belonging to Ashcroft Estate, yet the signature matches both the 1937 and 1961 filings. Archivists examining the documents decades later noted inconsistencies. Dates, titles, and annotations shift depending on the observer, yet the signature remains constant, almost as if the act of writing the name summons the record itself into alignment. School logs demonstrate a similar pattern. Children enrolled under Ashcroft surnames in 1928 and 1943 appear to occupy the same physical and behavioral profile. Nonverbal communication, symbolic drawing, chanting. By the 1970s, a descendant enrolled in a neighboring county exhibits identical patterns. Observation notes specify the same rituals, the same symbols, and the same rhythm. Records suggest that the name itself serves as a binding agent, connecting the past and present, encoding family behavior into both memory and official documentation. Oral histories reinforce this uncanny continuity. A 1965 interview with a retired teacher describes an instance in which a student traced the Ashcroft name in a workbook. Suddenly, several other children in the class repeated symbols previously unknown to them. It was as if the name itself commanded recognition, the teacher noted. Diary entries corroborate this phenomenon. Anyone recording the surname reports a compulsion to document corresponding symbols, even unintentionally, as though the holler, the family, or the legacy of ritual itself ensures observation continues. Photographs provide additional evidence. A set of black and white images from 1938 shows a child holding a small clay figure, the floor etched with loops identical to those described in Ashcroft diaries. A 1979 photograph of a descendant shows the same posture, the same gesture, the same faint patterns in the floor, despite decades and changing households. Archivists describe this repetition as a form of temporal resonance, wherein the Ashcroft name acts as both anchor and conduit, ensuring that presence is preserved across generations, both physically and in documentation. County records highlight another layer. In 1942, a report describes a missing child linked to the Ashcrofts. When the name is referenced in subsequent reports, sometimes Ashcroft, sometimes J. Ashcroft, occasionally redacted entirely, the description of the child's behaviors, symbols, and chants remains unchanged. Observers attempting to catalog the records note that any reference to the surname invokes patterns preserved in documents even if the names themselves are altered or omitted. The act of speaking or writing the name seems to align the record, reinforcing ritual and observation alike. Legal correspondence and archival notes further illustrate the power of the name. Letters between county officials, often buried in microfilm archives, note that observers recording the surname were compelled to catalog behavior, symbols, and rituals. Marginalia emphasize consistency. Names invoke the pattern. Observers comply unconsciously. In some cases, handwriting in letters matches the historical signature, even when composed by individuals decades later, suggesting that the name itself carries a procedural force capable of rewriting records, maintaining coherence, and enforcing continuity. Even modern records reflect this persistence. Social media posts referencing the Ashcroft name often coincide with symbols appearing in unexpected locations, videos of chants at dusk, or photographs capturing fleeting shadows along ridges. Observers report a compulsion to document, describe, and draw patterns once the name is invoked. Police reports, though often redacted, confirm repeated sightings of Ashcroft descendants performing behaviors identical to those documented in 1930s files, reinforcing the idea that the name binds history, ritual, and geography together in a continuous loop. This phenomenon is more than coincidence. Across decades, files, and observers, the name serves as both key and cipher. Saying it aloud, writing it down, or noticing it in archives triggers recognition, replication, and documentation. The Holler's memory, the Ashcroft family's rituals, and observers' perceptions converge through the act of naming. The name does not merely exist. It organizes, preserves, and enforces continuity across generations, ensuring that Coal Creek's legacy cannot be erased, ignored, or forgotten. The records end, but the holler does not. Coal Creek remains unmarked on most maps, its ridges and valleys etched into memory rather than paper. GPS coordinates lead only to fog, rocks, and forested slopes that refuse to resolve into a clear image. County files trail off in 1945. Microfilm archives end mid-sentence. Diaries stop abruptly. Photographs freeze in shadow. And yet, visitors to the ridge continue to feel the same presence, hear the faint hymn, and see the subtle movements of children whose names never appear in official registers. One of the last surviving correspondences from a 1962 county archivist reads, "I have never witnessed phenomena like this. Names, symbols, and behavior appear to repeat independently of time. Observation continues even when files are closed. The holler retains memory that no document can fully capture. I fear the record is never complete." These words, preserved in a sealed envelope, were found decades later in a storage closet of the Historical Society, unsigned and undated beyond November 1962. It is one of the few acknowledgments of Coal Creek that escaped suppression, yet it raises more questions than answers. Property surveys from 1970 note that the Ashcroft cabin remains intact, but occupants are gone. The walls hold faint traces of symbols, the floor creaks in patterns consistent with historic ritual, and no birds land near the chimney. Observers visiting in 1989 describe shadows moving within the house, even when the windows are closed and the building appears empty. One note in a 1990 field journal states simply, "They are still here, though we see them not." The holler functions as both archive and entity, preserving memory beyond bureaucratic control, beyond human understanding. Attempts to trace descendants lead to inconclusive results. Census records, obituaries, and marriage licenses intersect strangely. Ashcroft, Holloway, Brackenridge, and other families appear, disappear, or reappear across decades, often in locations untraceable by conventional means. Modern investigations, including local genealogical societies and ancestry databases, encounter gaps where surnames vanish from records only to resurface with new symbols, new behaviors, and the same ritualized language. It is as if the holler itself manages lineage, inserting memory, observation, and identity selectively into the human record. Observers who attempt to document the holler encounter subtle interference. Digital cameras capture anomalies, shadows where none exist, faint lines that match historical symbols, and movement that defies perspective. Audio recordings reveal faint chanting, sometimes in patterns that match the hollow hymn. Compasses swing without cause. Drones lose signal over specific portions of the ridge. Each attempt to make the holler legible only reinforces its opacity. The more one seeks to understand, the more the holler asserts control over observation. Local folklore and oral histories confirm a persistent, living pattern. Residents report dreams of children chanting on ridges, of shadows aligning in rhythmic formations, and of whispers calling their names through fog and trees. The hollow hymn is remembered across generations, though its origin is obscured. Accounts describe physical compulsion, feet drawn to the ridge, eyes compelled to follow movement, hands tracing symbols unconsciously. The holler does not merely preserve memory, it enforces recognition, ensuring that witnesses, whether willing or not, participate in its continuity. Archival fragments hint at unrecorded events. Coroner reports list unidentified children, school logs note absent students whose presence is nonetheless recorded in symbols, and letters from the 1940s mention fires that destroyed evidence. The combination of suppression, geography, and ritual renders Coal Creek a liminal space, at once documented and erased, present and absent, visible only through partial testimony and fragmentary observation. Researchers who attempt to close the files confront an uncomfortable truth. The holler's logic cannot be fully captured in ink, microfilm, or digital record. Even the landscape itself carries the memory. Ridges, hollows, and valleys appear to remember movement, echoing footsteps, and preserving patterns of behavior across generations. Hikers report sudden fog that appears only when symbols are drawn, unexpected sounds in the wind matching historical chants, and shadows that align with documented rituals. Geography, ritual, and memory converge in a way that defies conventional explanation, suggesting that the holler functions as both archive and agent, preserving the Ashcroft legacy and its regional pattern. The holler's silence is selective, its memory persistent. Documents may be restricted, files erased, and witnesses disappear, but Coal Creek endures in observation, in whispers, in shadows, in fog. Every symbol drawn, every chant remembered, every note in a diary contributes to a living record beyond bureaucratic control. The Ashcrofts, their descendants, and the network of families across the hollers are woven into the land itself, a fabric of ritual, memory, and presence that cannot be destroyed. If you have ever witnessed the unknown, walked a ridge that seemed alive, seen shadows that repeat patterns, or heard the hollow hymn echoing through trees, leave your account below. Your observation preserves what authorities, fire, and time sought to erase. Every comment reinforces the holler's continuity, connecting past to present and keeping the Ashcroft legacy alive. Coal Creek was never meant to be fully understood, but through your voice, the records continue, the symbols persist, and the holler speaks again. The ridge awaits, the cabin waits, and the shadows wait. Every moment you recall, every word you write, adds to a memory that refuses erasure. And though the files may vanish, the holler endures, patient, watchful, and ever awake.